please grab coffee and refreshments. It's just going to take us a few minutes to get settled. So wasn't that amazing? I'm sure someone will ask, we are clearly using up a supply of cups that were bound for the landfill anyway. These are not our usual coffee cups. I will. Welcome. It's taking us just a few minutes to get started, but I am not worried about that. Today we are talking about being rooted in Celtic Christianity. You all know the theme of the year is rooted in love. And when the Spiritual Life Guild met earlier this summer to talk about what programs might fit into the thematic arc, everybody said they wanted to do a program on Celtic Christianity and the roots of Anglicanism that are sort of embedded in that ancient practice. So 2 members of the Spiritual Life Guild today, Linda King Thomas and David Riddle, are going to speak. They have a magnificent PowerPoint that we will eventually, oh, look at that. God, Jeff can do, like, Jeff Crawford, ladies and gentlemen. There is nothing he cannot do. I will turn this over to Linda and David and enjoy Rooted in Celtic Christianity.
All right. Good morning, everyone. How close do you have to hold this? Oh, well, we'll do it this way.
I tell you what, do you want to put on a lavalier, Mike? Put it like an ice cream cone.
All right, here we go. Doesn't taste like an ice cream cone, but anyway. All right, David and I and several other parishioners from the Chapel of the Cross attended a retreat called the Celtic Christianity Retreat that was at St. Philip's Episcopal Church. And the speaker there was Reverend Bill Livingston, and he kindly allowed us to use some of his slides. So I'm giving homage to him. Now I have to figure out how to advance it. Haha. And I also wanted to acknowledge the native tribes that were on this land as we gather here on the indigenous lands of the Catawba, the Chirrah, the Eno, the Lumbee, the Occaneechi, the Shakori, and the Tuscarora people. And the reason I really wanted to talk about that is that the Celtics, also being an indigenous group of individuals, held the land sacred. And I thought it was really fitting, since we're talking about Celtic Christianity, that we also acknowledge our indigenous tribes who also protected and held these lands very, very sacred and important for them. Let's see here. So the ancient practice of Celtic spirituality provides us a pathway for deepening our spiritual lives, our relationship to Christ, our relationship with each other, and our relationship with the earth. And we find nods to Christian spirituality in many Episcopal churches, including our own. And you may recognize the Celtic cross that's just outside the chapel doors. So I'm going to send this to David now. And he's going to be our speaker.
For a little while, yes. I'm realizing as I'm looking at these small notes that I can't read them, so I'm going to read from here. So one of the reasons that I have inserted this slide, or that we inserted this slide, I think anytime that I want to study something, I always ask myself the question, why? Why should we study it? And I think that's an important question for us today as we look at Celtic spirituality. And I think it's a pretty long quote, but I'd like for us to read it. The ancient perspective has always been a relevant and vibrant way of guiding the spiritual journey. And it is profoundly relevant at this time in human history as there is such spiritual interest around the globe, but a strong distrust of religious institutions to nurture or guide that soul hunger. Additionally, the earth is screaming, or perhaps weeping would be a better word, at having been mistreated and disrespected for so long. And it is asking us to return to a life-sustaining and mutually affirming relationship. God is generous in love, and the creation has always been generous in her willingness to offer and sustain life. Whereas the Western Christian traditions, Catholic and Protestant in all its forms, have in many ways failed to inspire current generations, the ancient and modern Celtic perspective invites a respectful invitation to remember who we are as dignified representations of life, love, and Christ's beautiful spirit throughout all of creation. David Kirk has a website that I found in preparation for this presentation, and I would recommend that you guys go to his website because it is one, if you're interested in following a Celtic path, it's one that you can do on a daily basis through his website. So we're looking for ways to deepen our relationship with God and relationship with our earth. So many of us think or practice Celtic Christianity, spirituality, but don't know it. Well-known Christians whose theology and practices resemble Celtic Christianity and who have been challenged by the Western Orthodox Christianity. Richard Rohr, we've done some study of him. St. Francis, Julian of Norwich, Desmond Tutu, and Teilhard de Chardin. Okay, I think I can return to my slides now. Rather than based on doctrines or scholars, Celtic Christianity is based on that inner presence of God that occurred in creation. Therefore, much of what is found in Celtic Christianity is also found in many indigenous religions, was emphasized by the mystics, and occurs in many of us without knowing why. All right. Let's take a look at some fundamental questions here. Who were the Celts? Why do we associate them with the British Isles? And why are the British Isles significant to Celtic Christianity? Now, I do not want to presume to be an expert on any of these questions, and if we have an expert or experts in the audience, would you identify yourselves now? Anybody made a pilgrimage to Iona or, oh, we've got some, Northumbria? Okay. You want to join us up here? So who were the Celts? Well, we tend to end up identifying them as where they ended up, but they actually emerged around 1200 BC and were primarily located in regions that now comprise modern-day Austria, France, British Isles, and parts of Spain and Turkey. They're believed to have originated from the Urnfield culture in Central Europe, which was characterized by the practice of cremation and burial in urns. Over time, they spread across Europe, establishing various tribes and cultures, including the Gauls, Celtiberians, and Britons. Okay, why do we associate them with the British Isles? Those of you who have been may have an answer for us. Would you like to offer an answer, folks who have been? No? Okay. Think of where the British Isles are in relationship to the rest of the continent. It's on the outer fringes. Did Rome invade Ireland? No. Okay, so it was a safer haven, and was a little bit more resistant, I would say, to some of the practices that were going on in the Roman Empire, but eventually they were as we will see, changed somewhat. Okay, let's talk about Celtic Christianity versus Celtic spirituality, because there are folks today who are interested in Celtic spirituality that does not have anything to do with Christianity. Some Celtic beliefs and practices were incorporated into Celtic Christianity, specifically its connection to creation. Celtic Christianity is Christ-centered, Celtic spirituality is not. I think in order to take a look at the Celtic Christian beliefs, it's important to take a look at the pre-Christian Celtic beliefs, because that some of these are incorporated into the Celtic Christian beliefs. So there's a sense of nearness to the spirit world, often through nature, a belief in the goodness of the natural world, a belief in the closeness of eternity to everyday life, a weak belief in the idea that humans are tainted by original sin, a tendency to personify evil forces, a tendency to express religious truth through poetry and analogy rather than analysis, a focus on mystical understanding rather than structure. Okay. Big overview of the timeline of the spread of Celtic Christianity. The timeline of Celtic Christianity is marked by significant events and developments that shaped its identity and practices. Some of the key points are: the early Middle Ages. Celtic Christianity emerged as a distinct form of Christianity in the British Isles and parts of Europe, influenced by Celtic culture and pre-Christian beliefs, which we just talked about. The Celtic Church was an independent entity separate from the Roman Church, with its own bishops, monasteries, and liturgical traditions. Missionary efforts. The spiritual fervor of the Celts and the missionary efforts of the figures like St. Patrick and St. Columba played crucial roles in spreading of Celtic Christianity. Integration with the Roman Church over time, we're going to talk about that. Over time, Celtic Christianity began to integrate with the practices and customs of the Roman Church, leading to a gradual shift in its identity and practices. The timeline of Celtic Christianity reflects the dynamic nature of its development, adapting to the changing world while maintaining its unique identity and practices. Okay. I don't want to get buried in the weeds here, but I do want to do a little bit of a timeline. So I'm going to do this quickly. And we may have handouts by the end of today, or end of this session. In 410, the last Roman troops leave Britain. Anglo-Saxon invaders destroy most remaining churches except for the western fringes. In 435, a century of evangelism begins by Patrick, Brigid, Brendan, Colombo, and leaves a land of saints shaped by large communities of faith with homegrown leaders. In 450, in Wales and Cornwall, a century of planting mission communities inspired by the desert Christians. By Germanus, Illtyd, Samson, Petrarch, David leave them lands of faith. In 560, Columbus spreads mission communities in Iona and Scotland. And then, in 591, Columbanus and others found mission communities throughout Europe. In 597, here we get to where it's going to get a little bit conflicted. The Bishop of Rome sends a mission team led by Augustine, which eventually developed a national organization and a spirituality that seems oppressive to the Celtic churches. In 635, Aidan is sent from Iona to start a mission to the English from Lindisfarne. With its partner community at Whitby, led by Hilda, it sends missionaries to the east of England, the Midlands, and further south. So we get the England is the mission field there. Okay. In 1664, the Synod of Whitby is sort of a mile marker in Celtic Christianity. There were growing differences between the Roman Church and the Celtic Church. And so during this Synod of Whitby, the Roman Church was trying to enforce its own calculation of the days of Easter, their date of Easter. There were differences in the ways that was calculated. And Cuthbert and Hilda sadly accepted these changes, the regulations, for the sake of unity, but maintained Celtic spirituality. The Roman regulations are accepted in 696 in Northern Ireland, 716 in Scotland, 755 in Wales, 690 and 755 in Wales. Another area that Linda's going to talk about is around 690, the golden age of study and art happened. The Lindisfarne Gospels are inscribed, and later the Book of Kells. Okay. So what happened to Celtic Christianity? It thrived until 597 with the arrival of the imperial Christian mission in Britain. With it came the demand for uniformity with the Roman Church and its alliance with imperial power. Original sin doctrine required clerical celibacy, subordination of the role of women, church hierarchy, imposition of sexual restrictions, and required rituals. The Synod of Whitby in 664 outlawed Celtic Christianity and its teaching. The community of the Isle of Iona and most of Scotland resisted compliance. The high-standing Celtic crosses become prominent. It served another 500 years. In every generation, anyone teaching something from the Celtic Christianity has been silenced. But it has remained. So the rebirth of Celtic Christianity, new scholarship, research, and discovery are discovering the surviving writings of Pelagius. We're going to talk about Pelagius. Remnants which survived the cleansing have become more known, the Isle of Iona and the Iona community, and Lindisfarne and the Northumbria community. There's been a surge of authors with enthusiasm about Celtic Christianity, particularly John Philip Newell, and wandering souls disillusioned in disagreement with teachings of and are no longer fed by Western Orthodox Christianity stumble into Celtic Christianity. Okay, Linda, I think I'm going to skip over some things, so you have a chance to speak. This will be we have talked about. Just real briefly, differences between Western Orthodox and Celtic Christianity structures. On the left, you will see a Western Orthodox structure, pretty ornate. On the right, you will see a Celtic structure. On the left, a structure that's more complex and ornate with a rounded dome. On the right, a smaller, simpler, more intimate structure, originally using timber with steeply pitched roofs. And Linda's going to talk about some of the other differences. Okay, I did want to talk about this. There were differences in other ways. And I will confess my ignorance. Until this workshop that I went to, I had really not heard of Pelagius before. Have any of you heard of Pelagius? Of course, our rector has, thankfully. Would you like to come up here and talk about Pelagius, please? Right. Okay, so yes, Pelagius was considered or was eventually labeled a heretic. What is interesting to me is that I would say probably, I would guess most of us in this room would probably say that we kind of like what Pelagius had to say. So let's take a look at the differences. Western Orthodoxy, and of course I'm not going to be able to read this, so I'm going to back up and read from the screen. Augustine of Hippo, of Roman North African origin, lived a lustful life until his conversion to Christianity. May have had connections with the emperor, proposed the doctrine of original sin. Human sin did not exist until Adam and Eve ate of the forbidden fruit, for which they and all generations must die. And this original sin was passed through conception. Pelagius was of more of a Celtic British origin. I think he was Welsh. Proposed all humans are born good and innocent, but choose to commit sins not because of Adam's sins. We're graced with the nobility of divine birth. The more we sin, the more difficulty we have not sinning. The first three councils accepted Pelagius' teaching. The fourth council rejected his teaching. Augustine had him identified as a heretic, banned him from teaching, and had all his writings destroyed. Original sin was not accepted by Eastern Orthodoxy, but humans have a fallen nature which is inherited. Recent scholarly research has determined Pelagius continued to write under a pseudonym without making his writings public, and shows what Augustine contributed to Pelagius is attributed to Pelagius is not accurate. Some of the key differences. So Augustine's sacrificial atonement theology, because something had to be sacrificed to assuage God's judgment and condemnation of human sin. Jesus was the sacrifice to avoid this condemnation. To receive the benefit of the sacrifice requires baptism. This was the origin of last rites. The Roman Catholic doctrine remains that unbaptized persons cannot go to heaven. This includes infants, but infants do go to a special place called limbo. Pelagius' epiphany theology, Jesus reveals the deep presence and love of God and the essence of our souls. Christ came to disclose the deepest truth of our being and to be our memory of all we have forgotten. The focus of his teachings were the sacredness of the human soul, of nature, of spiritual practice, of wisdom and compassion. And there were types of grace. Original grace, all is grace. Grace of illumination and inner cleansing, which allows us to see the sacred shining deep in all things. And that grace of forgiveness and mercy. When we fail, grace of forgiveness is given that we may live again from our true depths. Sounds reasonable, right? Yeah. Okay. So this is where Miss Linda is going to take over.
Thank you. Thank you. So, moving then into what some of the Celtic Christianity beliefs and characteristics and practices. And we've talked a lot about this sort of deep love and respect for the earth, the spirit of joy found in nature. And so the belief is the earth is sacred, and our environmental stewardship really is a responsibility of the soul, so that it is our purpose here that we need to safeguard the earth. The triune God, the Celtics definitely believed in the triune God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And the presence of the Holy Spirit is often called the wild goose. I found this most entertaining because the Celtic Christians believe the Holy Spirit, the goose, is sort of its untamed, mysterious, guiding nature, leads people on adventurous and unpredictable spiritual journeys. I think that's really wild. So it's sort of like they would take off on missions and, not have a care in the world, and just believed that the wild goose was going to lead them. That's really true faith. The other piece is that, so it's viewed as a powerful and transformative, leading the way where people need to go. Another component is this hospitality and compassion. There was a belief that wisdom could be found in other non-Christian cultures, peoples, practices. And the Celts were very accepting of this, even accepting of their own pagan past. As we've seen, a lot of those beliefs were incorporated into the Christianity. There's also this component of welcoming and caring for the stranger. The monasteries in particular had this very much of an open door, because if you honor the divine when you welcome a guest, since you are welcoming God or Jesus. So that was a very strong component. And the monasteries, the monastic way of life and a sense of community is also very characteristic of the Celtic way of life. These monasteries were centers for religious and cultural life. They had a role for learning in the arts, scholarships, in the illuminated texts that we've heard about, particularly the Book of Kells, which is probably one of the most famous, but there were many, many others that were produced. It was a missionary hub. They were bases for spreading Christianity into new areas, hence the wild goose taking you out to spread the word. They were economic and social centers. They managed lands. They provided social services like the hospitality for those who were in need. And they were spiritual centers, so there was a communal life. The villages surrounded the monastery, and they were intertwined and interwoven, even with lay people participating in some of the daily rites. That didn't go. Okay. All right. So we've talked about a little bit. Oh. I think I went too far. No. All right. Sorry. Getting lost in my own slides. So with the role of the women and the feminine in the Celtic Christianity, it always confuses me when they go that way. So anyway, so there's a sacredness of the feminine. Women were allowed to celebrate Mass, which was then prohibited by the bishops in 520. The veneration of Bridget, we all heard of Saint Bridget, who was also a saint, and she was also, by legend, said that she was actually she was an abbess, but she became a bishop. And the idea that the womb is also sacred and a threshold to birth, and that all water, including the seas, streams, rivers, and the water of our birth, are sacred. So as we move into the honoring, as we move into the honoring of the feminine, we talked a little bit about Bridget, but we also have the spiritual practice of meditative prayer and a soul friend called an anamchara. And this was, I think we also have aspects of meditative prayer, contemplative prayer, centering prayer, that we also embrace as part of that sacred practice. The anamchara is the soul friend, and it's sort of similar to spiritual directors of today, our journey partners, the committed friend. It could be a knowledgeable companion who can point out blessings and dangers of the path ahead, or mutual companions where you guide one another in seeing the holy around us. We also have the idea of thresholds or thin places. The thinning of the veil between the physical and spiritual world provides that sense of mystery and connection to the divine. And I suspect that many of you have experienced these thin places or these thresholds, whether it's finding the sacred in the ordinary, being awake and aware. Sometimes we see this a lot in nature. Could be a sunrise or a sunset. It can also be an experience, the birth of a child or staying vigil on a deathbed. And so how many of you have experienced some of these thin places, these thresholds? Yeah. So lots of hands went up. So I think that that is sort of beautiful and sacred in that sense of feeling close to the God, our God. Okay. Oops. So as we take a look at the Celtic Christianity art, there was this explosion in art in the 7th and 12th century. The Book of Kells was in the early 9th century, and the Celtic cross also arose or originated during this time period. What I find interesting is that during these 500 years, this is the period of oppression in Celtic history. This is when the Roman Church was really pushing down, restricting, limiting the preaching of the Celtic Christianity beliefs. And it was during this repression, then there was this resurgence there was this resistance. And the resistance was primarily in Ireland and in northern Scotland, and in particular in Iona. And so Iona plays a role in the Book of Kells. We always think of the Book of Kells as being Irish. It's currently in Trinity Centre in Dublin. But it really, perhaps, the strongest theory is that it was perhaps started in Iona and then traveled to the Abbey of Kells to be finished. And the Celtic cross is also, it actually originated from a pagan symbol, the circle, with a plus sign sort of cross inside of it. And for the pagans, that probably represented the sun. But the circle in the Celtic Christianity interpretation is that of the cosmos. And the other piece is the cross itself then represents Christ. These crosses became very tall. They were planted deep in the earth, sort of symbolizing the connection between grace and nature, spirit and matter, and heaven and earth. The interlocking knot pattern is also important in that it's impossible to find a beginning and an end. Heaven and earth are inseparably woven together. The crosses were used to mark boundaries. They were placed outside the walls of the monastic settlements, and they were signs and symbols for people that there was refuge and sanctuary then within the monastery. And so we have our own Celtic cross here at the Chapel of the Cross. And it wasn't until this time that I actually became interested in what was on the cross. What were those carvings? And so as I took a closer look, and also in reference to the Book of Kells, which has figures and pictures of the Gospels, in the very center is the Lamb of God, Christ. And as we start at the very top, you'll see an angel, which represents John. And as we move clockwise, we come to a lion, which represents Mark. The bottom is an ox, which represents Luke. And on the left is an angel for Matthew. And that's what's carved. Did I get it wrong? Okay. At the top, the eagle. All right, thank you. And then we also have our Celtic knots that provide that interlacing pattern, the never-ending connection between heaven and earth. And I'm going to let David talk briefly because he has some more history to share about the Celtic cross. Say what?
It's John. Um, is Terry here? Eason? No. Okay. I had a fascinating conversation with Terry Eason in preparation for this visit. How many of you know why there is a Celtic cross in our front yard? Who is responsible for that? We don't know that history? Pardon? 10 minutes. How many of you know the name Pokey Doke? This was Pokey's gift to the church. There's also an inscription at the bottom that she wanted written. I wish we had that. From Revelation about wiping every tear. But this was Pokey's gift to the Chapel of the Cross. I'm sorry, I didn't have the opportunity to know her. There was, and I don't know if any of you are aware of this, but there was also another Celtic cross that was associated with the chapel. Does anyone know what the other Celtic cross we had? Where it is now? It's in the attic. Do we know why it's in the attic? It's a copper spire that was damaged during a hurricane. I don't know which one. Some of you may know, but it was blown off. So that was probably our first Celtic cross. And then the one that was installed by Pokey's, by Pokey, yes. Yeah, let's go ahead and do the prayer. I just wanted to speak a little bit about John. John's gospel was very informative to the Celtic community. And I find it fascinating, and you guys may know this, but I think it's fascinating for a couple of reasons. The Gospel of John is considered a more sensual gospel from the standpoint of it does involve the senses, more so than the synoptic gospels. And that was quite, the Celts were able to wrap their heads around that a little bit better because it was the embodiment of Christ into the world. Also, the Celts took a lot of inspiration from the monastic communities, the Desert Mothers and Fathers, and John was a favorite of theirs as well. So I wanted to share that aspect too, because neither of us talked about that. Anyways, what I'd like for us to do, shall we go ahead and we will end with this prayer, and everyone who's comfortable with saying it out loud, but I think it's a good summary of sort of what we're about today. Dear Lord, for everything that emerges from earth, thanks be to you, O God, holy root of being, sacred sap that rises, full-bodied fragrance of earth's unfolding form. May we know that we are of you. May we know that we are in you. May we know that we are one with you, together one. Guide us as nations to what is deepest. Open us as peoples to what is first. Lead us as a world to what is dearest, that we may know the holiness of wholeness, that we may learn the strength of humility, and together we may live close to earth and grow in grounded glory. Amen. Thank you, folks. Any questions? I'd love to hear from folks who have made pilgrimages to
Where's the other? Yeah.
Iona.
Hi, have always wondered why our Celtic cross is so tall. Is there some dimensional, like it has to be a certain height and a certain width?
Oh, does this work? Yes. Just had to figure out which way to turn it on. So they were made very tall. And in Scotland and in other places where you see the ancient ones, they are even taller. And it is part of that reaching up to heaven, that connection of earth and heaven together, and that they are planted very deep in the earth in order to support that really high arch. So it is a characteristic of those crosses.
One thing I'd like to share another thing that Terry said. So symbolically, there is the circle in the cross, which would have symbolic theological significance. There's also a very practical significance. If these crosses are made of stone, if there was not the arches supporting it, what would happen? The arms would fall off. So I thought that was interesting from an architectural standpoint. So it's the physical manifestation of gravity, I guess.
Yeah. Any other question or comment? Y'all, thank you so much. That was wonderful. And the handouts made it downstairs for those who want them.
Oh, did they? I don't know.
There's some handouts by the front desk. If
Okay,
you would
great.
like to take some of the slides home and think about them, you can do so. So thank you. Thank you so much.
So one thing I will say, Spiritual Life Guild, and we don't have any timetable, but we at some point do want to sponsor a pilgrimage to Iona. So I'm throwing that out there, okay? That's good. Let's wild goose this thing, okay? So, don't know when that is. Stay tuned. Yes.
I went with a group from church with Tammy Lee years ago, and it was a really very moving time just to be there, and you just feel that connection with the earth and with the heavens kind of coming together. So I would highly recommend a visit.
Thank you.
It's a beautiful day to walk in the Arboretum, too. If you can't go to Iona today, you can go to the Coker Arboretum.
Or you can go to the front yard and take a look at the cross.